Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Around the Corner podcast series where we'll discuss the latest scientific discoveries, technological advances, and what is around the corner, and what is about to come in advanced material innovation and a paradigm shift that is coming towards us as a result of COVID-19. Today with us, I have Dr.Leroy Magwood, CTO at XG Sciences, and I am really excited because this XG Sciences is a graphene company. So I am really excited to hear a little bit more about the company itself. And also, Leroy, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here.
I certainly appreciate you extending the opportunity.
Absolutely. We're lucky to have you here today. Tell us about Leroy. Who is Leroy? What's your journey like?
Not to be convoluted, like most people, I'm stuck between my past and future, which is good and bad. Growing up, I grew up in a kind of an emerging home. Mother, father, they got divorced early, in the way that shaped me to become more a scientist. My dad was in construction, and I was always fascinated by how everything went together in construction. My mom actually switched from nursing to education.
Interesting.
So she pushed me to be highly educated, even though she kept her limiting beliefs out of it. So my mom was definitely afraid of math. So she'd always ask me things in math and pretend everything was my thought. So I gravitated towards math because of her inability to do math, which led me into physics. So I went and got a bachelor's in physics and ultimately led me to a PhD. And again, that was a challenge because the first professor I met, I'd done a summer project in undergrad for my PhD, and he told me it was complete crap. He said, if you come to University of Iowa and work with me, I'll show you how to be a real scientist. Even though I only partially believed him, the fact that he called me out was something that, to that point, no one had ever said, look, I think you have talent. I think what you're doing is crap. And I think if you make the right investments, you could be the person that you want to become. So
did you do that?
Got my attention, but his desire to invest is what drove me to the University of Iowa, that PhD.
So you did your PhD in University of Iowa, and what happened then?
I kind of fell in love with polymers and polymer science. So my background, I'm actually a UV chemist. So I do a lot of photochemistry, which, nanomaterials it's not in the realm of photochemistry. It's really what we rail against. It stops us from doing work because it blocks light. So, because it always got in my way, I always found myself needing a nanomaterial in order to increase the property, but knowing that it would limit me from where I wanted to go. So after my PhD, I started working in places that would allow me to really get in and explore nanomaterials, really as an exciting emerging field, and to figure out how I could pull all of those things from my past into my future, which is why I started off by saying I'm a person stuck between my past and future.
So where did, on that scale of past and future, what happened after your degree? So you've had multiple appointments in the past decade. Oh, yeah. What's the story there?
I guess I'm a person that, when you consider industry as a whole, there's a dynamic to industry that's it's present, but it's present to different degrees. So if I go to a budding company, an emerging company, there's a lot of buzz, there's a lot of energy there because they're trying to get someplace. Whereas if you go to a more established company, you realize that they're trying to hold their position, and sometimes they are risk averse. So I've taken time to carefully navigate, where I've gone. I've tried emerging companies. I've tried established companies, but to figure out what works for my personality. And that's one of the things that I think most people are afraid to do. I mean, you're literally leaving secure money to go find yourself. You either become an entrepreneur or you go out and you become a destitute scientist. You're always traveling between things. And I've never been afraid to be a destitute. And I've also never been afraid to be an entrepreneur. So I'm always, hey, let's go with a company that says, hey, I'm new, I'm starting. If you can get me from 0 to 60, we can work together. and eventually become an established company, but that may change the dynamics. So hopefully they can establish while keeping the same energy, which was the only reason I decided, okay, well, become a CTO. At least in a starting company, you can ensure that once you're established, you can make sure that energy is there by the people you hire, by the programs you pull in, and by the talent you recruit. So it changed my dynamics in that regard.
Tell us about XG Science. This is really interesting perspective on that. And yes, I do share the same sentiment in the vitality of an
Yes.
emerging company. You're excited. You know that you can shape a path. Bigger organizations, it can be quite clunky. You can be a part of it, but you cannot necessarily move the beast as fast as you can. In an emerging company, you can. So tell us about XG Sciences and your role.
So my role is, I have a title, and then I have a role. So
interesting distinction.
Chief Technology Officer. But in that role, like if I were an established company, I'd be, in meetings, engaging with customers, trying to figure out how do we stay on the forefront of technology, whether it's through mergers and acquisitions. We're looking outward while maintaining everything inwardly. At XG Sciences, it's small enough and nimble enough that I can actually do some of those same traditional things that a CTO would do while actually going back into the lab and being active. So I'm kind of half CTO, half day manager. And I like the swing in between the two because, the people see me on the day-to-day. They're able to, you realize with your experience, it becomes invaluable, but your creativity is more valuable. So trying to navigate the two is always an issue. If I look at my staff and I enable each of them to create their own projects where, hey, it's me and you on a project and we'll integrate everybody in as we need to. So give them the sovereignty to really behave as independence within the company. It frees me up to do things, but it also expands my mental capability because I've taken on the view of each employee and figured out how to solve a problem through their eyes, which when you think about a customer, at the end of the day, that's what you're trying to do. So every employee is now a customer, and I have the ability to go to my customer on a daily basis and say, how have your needs changed since you went to sleep last night, and where do you think we should pivot? So that nimbleness kind of stays with me, and I'm able to keep my energy up just by being at a company like XG Sciences. And of course, we're a graphene company, so there's
tell us about it. Yes, tell us about those of us who might not necessarily be familiar with the company. Tell us a little bit about the story and a little bit about graphene production, etc.
Right. So for us, we have two different pathways. We take the more traditional Hummers type method, chemical reduction to get to graphene.
What is graphene, first of all? Maybe some of the people who are listening have no idea what graphene is. We're kind of assuming everybody knows what graphene is. Okay, tell us, Leroy, tell us what graphene is.
I didn't know that wasn't true, that everyone didn't know what graphene was.
Oh, trust me, there are still people who don't know what graphene is.
So the simplest way to put it is graphene's a two-dimensional platelet of highly organized carbon. Within that platelet, you have a plane, which there's so many properties that are achievable, simply because there's so much electron density. You can use almost any other external energy source in order to power something with graphene. And I don't think I don't think anyone's gotten to the point where they've looked at the full scope or scale of graphene, but even what we've seen, we're excited by it. So that's where we play. We make graphene by different metrics and different modes, and that allows us to actually play into a number of different industries, whether it's automotive through paints and coatings, electronics, which is kind of the natural one since everyone loves the conductivity, thermal and electrical of graphene. It takes the moniker of the world's one of the world's best super materials, but that's only because it's stronger than most things that we've seen. It has better thermal conductivity, and to some limit, it can potentially have better electrical conductivity than most materials that we know that work in those spaces. So It's an exciting time to be in the field of graphene research and development, and more so graphene implementation, because we've been researching and developing it for a while. The implementation has been a part that's been a bit slow coming, but at XG Sciences, we're right there on the forefront. So that often helps to see what's coming down the pipeline.
Leo, can you tell us a little bit more about some of the segments and application categories that XG Sciences plays with graphene? You mentioned automotive. What can you tell us about that? Paints and coatings. Tell us kind of some of those applications and products that are on the market right now.
I'm a person that's, like I said, I've been into a few industries. So paint and coating becomes one of the more exciting ones. And
why?
A quick search for it. Well, when you think of a paint, most people say, hey, my wall looks good. If we look at graphene, it actually adds several properties to paint, just because of the masks that are out there. Everyone, well, I shouldn't assume, but because of COVID, there's been a emergence of graphene-enabled face masks that are supposed to have antibacterial properties, antimicrobial properties. Why not make that into a paint? I mean, you're going to touch more paints than masks in a day. So if you're thinking about transfer or something that could come into play, paint, I worked at a paint company, and they would say, if you're doing bad, your punishment was literally to go and watch paint dry. So they put you in the drying rooms to see paint dry. But this could add to the excitement of even watching paint to dry, because you're now talking about a material that has high thermal conductivity. Can you make fast drying paints? I mean, the opportunities are endless. We just have to be creative enough to figure out some of what we are doing, some of what we're currently doing. If we re-envision it and reimagine it, there's no telling what we can do. So I'm actually excited to watch paint dry. I don't think it's a punishment anymore.
Maybe you can actually kind of shorten that time scale with graphene, so it's not such a punishment. You say, okay, yeah, I'm going to go and watch the paint dry. There, dry. Can I get out? It is really exciting, and everything that graphene can potentially provide for different product categories. But as you and I know, graphene sounds really exciting. I mean, I did my PhD on graphene, so I know that it's the reason why I chose graphene, even though I was supposed to go to university get my PhD in something completely different, was because it sounded so sci-fi. It was just so exciting. I mean, one atomic layer of carbon, this. But at the same time, when I got my PhD and I got out, when I was doing my postdoc, I started my first company, I realized commercialization of a material like that is extremely different than the things that we think is possible with it in the lab. Tell us a little bit about that process, because we read so much in the news, okay, graphene has the potential to do X, Y, Z, and it sounds so fascinating. And then investors get excited, the public gets excited, and then that does not come to fruition because it's not supposed to. It takes a long time for an industry to mature, but then the expectations come back and kick us in a behind, because people say, well, we thought you guys were going to have, I don't know, flexible phones by 2014. Well, you guys said it, so where is it? Tell us a little bit about that process of being realistic, but being optimistic about the potential and kind of paving that path.
You've said a lot there. And it's really any type of technology. If we go back to Facebook, it started as, really just a P2P through college campuses, and then through a series of pivots, it becomes the quintessential way that people get news now. Graphene has to take a very similar path. We all looked at graphene, and we looked at it in reference to what we currently have. So can graphene replace copper? Why should graphene replace copper? Why should it have to act as copper? Why should it have to act in the same space as copper? If it has properties that copper doesn't have, can you envision doing something very different with graphene that would just give you the thermal conductivity that you need? And I think graphene is really a victim of its own success. People have looked at all of these properties and they've extrapolated over a space that may not necessarily be the right space. For all the good of graphene, if it's not used in the right space, it's really just another material. It's another tool in your tool belt. And to some extent, we find that a lot. A customer comes to us and our first thought is, are you trying to transcend what's there, or are you looking for a tool? Once we figure that out, it's okay, well, if you're looking for a tool, you've got a 3 to 6 month window in which we can help you to find another tool that enables you to take another iterative step in your process. When you're trying to take transcendent steps, which is really where graphene is, I would say, pigeonholed. It's a transcendent material that everyone wants to take iterative steps with. Until you have a transcendent material and a transcendent process, you're never really going to see. And that's when we say, hey, how do we integrate graphene into things? It becomes, stop trying to integrate it into something. It is not the square peg or the round hole. Why are you keep trying to do that? I know it's comfortable because here is what we've done, here's what we've grown up with. If graphene would just go in and do this, life would be good. But I don't know if it necessarily has to go in and do this.
Then what is the alternative? So if we don't look at it that way, how do we go about it?
I mean, we're trained to look at it that way. I don't know very many people that are trained to stop and say, hey, here's graphene. Here are the limits at which graphene can work in a system. And, just as an example, I was working on a coating. And like most nanomaterials, the more you put in, you quickly hit a ceiling. The thing about graphene is it's a platelet. So it's not like a traditional pigment, but it's not like a filler. So you'd have mica, which is a platelet that you put in to control rheology. Well, graphene is somewhere in between. When we formulate, we either formulate it like a pigment. Here's graphene, we're going to put it in like a pigment. Well, it's a platelet. It has this hard rheology control that you now have to get past. And no one's come in and said, if it's this material that I want in this space, but it behaves like this, how do I bridge the gap? So it's really looking at the limits at which graphene works in multiple systems and then saying, there's a gap. Why don't I focus on this gap? I really haven't seen much where people are, if you want to say a gap analysis, they're running the gap analysis and building products that are purely based off of the gap that's in between two systems that graphene can fill, and then optimizing towards that gap between these two things.
Interesting.
I've done some of it, and I've ended up with some properties that are much better than even taking path A or path B, but I don't formulate everything. I just formulate what customers pay me to formulate.
Interesting perspective. And where do you think is the true potential? And take your professional hat with XG Sciences off, okay? Leroy, as a scientist and a graphene expert, so where do you think is the potential of graphene truly in the next few years? And then give us a perspective on next 10, 15 years.
That's
I'm putting you on the spot now.
It's okay. I've fallen down from higher places. With graphene, it's an interesting material. Bar none, I like it more in healthcare than anything else. Simply because it has a lot of, once you get past EPA, FDA, and any other three-letter organization that's going to tell me not to do it, there's a lot of room and space for graphene as a bioactive agent that you do external signaling with. We look at quantum dots and some of these things, but I think graphene would have a much broader scope in some of these spaces, especially when you think of cancer as one of the preemptive ones. How do you control cancer externally? I think graphene would have a really good run within that kind of parameterized system. It's probably going to take 15 years to get the government clearance for that, but that would give you the 15-year portion for the.
So you started with the limit of the government agencies, right. And then you went back and said, okay, this one. I said, think free.
Yes. There are some other places. Early on I did I guess early on I did too much. But one of the places I worked in was transplants, so like knee transplants. And one of the interesting things is I always want to put like graphene into there's a polyethylene cup. Putting graphene into that polyethylene cup would give polyethylene a little more rigidity, because usually it's either polyethylene or some sort of stainless steel, titanium. These are all the materials that they're used. But coating even titanium with graphene gives it a different lubricity. The tribology changes in hip joints, a lot of point-to-point contacts. I'm in a material science company that's focused on external materials, but I'm pretty sure by the time I leave, we'll be in biomaterials.
That is
just because every time I'm pivoting towards, I think a powder coating on a hip replacement would be great. How do we get graphene towards that? We got some hurdles, but getting graphene towards that, especially with an aging population, that's going to become a popular surgery, knee and hip replacements. The first person to actually get there, they're going to be very successful in that regard. So there's a lot of these things where you start looking at problems that are coming with an aging population and current problems just with the healthcare pandemics, and you realize that there's a really good place for graphene and a lot of other advanced materials too. But it's really kind of reducing these things to practice that's going to help us to kind of bridge some of those gaps and cross some of those gates that we need to get through.
So you mentioned, now that we're talking about pandemic, okay, aging population, and now let's get to the problem that we all have on our hands right now, the pandemic, okay? So you mentioned the coatings and paints potential for antibacterial, at some point perhaps antiviral. I think the jury's still out on that one. Coatings and paints. What else, or where else do you think graphene can actually add value in the next layers of needs that are going to be coming about as a result of COVID, or even the needs right now? And you are on the U.S. chapter of the Advanced Material Pandemic Taskforce's task force we started to look at how can we use these materials to actually help. How can we have folks such as yourself with that experience and expertise, but we can all come together and put these pieces of puzzle together to maybe fast track some of these activities. You were saying, okay, 15 years for us to get around EPA, FDA, et cetera. Maybe there is a pathway for all of us to come together and fast track that or do some of these things together. So where do you think is the potential of graphene in pandemic or global health emergencies? And then in the next question, I'll ask you about the emerging needs that might be coming up in the next few years as a result of the COVID-19.
Right. I mean, there's going to be a few places, even, as I think about it, if you extend the paint and coatings and just say the cooling aspects of it, a lot of the current technology that we have in place are limited. You have limited capacity based off of cooling. Graphene is really good at cooling. Can you extend the capability of a pharmaceutical company for drug development by putting in-system cooling?
Why is cooling important in drug development?
Well, why is cooling?
Yes, why is it important?
So most of these things are like small chain proteins.
Okay.
So you have a chemical reaction that you're trying to synthesize something, and through that synthesis process, if you break or broach a certain temperature, you actually make something very different. So for quality control, to make something that's going to be reproducible and robust, you have to control most aspects of manufacturing.
Interesting.
And a lot of times it's how do we make effective cooling systems? And I think that, if you drill down, cooling is a lot of gas, a lot of electricity. It's all the conventional things. With graphene, it's radiative. So if I put graphene on one side, you're back to your first semester thermodynamics, and you have 3 blocks together. And
oh darn! I have to remember those things now.
I'm sorry for bringing back that nightmare.
It was a nightmare.
Yes, mine too, though. But I've often wondered, look, if we just put these things together, can we heat one and force cooling, heating of others? So the heat transitions from one place to another. So recycled heating. I think that's a really big place that graphene can play a role. And even in common situations, your car, that's something else that heats up, especially now in the summer. Based off of painting, there's always going to be a primer layer. Can you force heating to certain spaces, certain directions, away from places that are impacted? So the surface of the car, the hood of the car, the roof of the car, most people are going to touch those spaces. Can you force heat down towards the ground so that those areas are at least protected? You can touch them. That's not going to help in any regard in the pandemic. But if you think about how things are going to be transported, they'll be transported by trucks, which is another thing. In warehousing, those are all places where a warehouse in Arizona in the summer can be well over 130, 140 F. Just standing. How do you now bring that down? You're going to have to store materials. So raw material costs, lifetime of raw materials, all of these things when we look at our supply chains are affected by heating. So if you just look at graphene as something that can actually transport or translate heat, is it effective to say that I put graphene on the roof and route heat down someplace else? Maybe, potentially. We see a lot of heat transfer for graphene, but that's going to be for some customers it's either going to be us selling it out to them or them coming back to us saying, hey, you said it, now we realize it's a problem, how do we solve it?
Hey, if you're listening to this right now, it might be a solution. Contact Leroy.
I might have slipped my CTO hat back on in there. But yeah, there's a lot.
What else can we think about? What else can we think about COVID? So I know that a lot of the effort has been put on graphene and masks, but let's get past that. What else can we think about besides antiviral and antibacterial coatings?
There's going to be a lot, outside of the coating. One of the spaces that I'm partially interested in is graphene as a catalyst. We've seen in certain reactions that it actually helps to improve. So that's not in drugs, but just in ethanol production. It's one of the things that I would want to look at. How do you produce ethanol, which becomes your sanitizer a little more effectively? We did a project a while ago with the company that I was with where we were looking at really trying to split something to get chlorine out. And it became rate limiting based off of heat. So if we were able to do it and get enough heat in quickly, we could get really chlorine glass that we would condense out. But, it's something that the only good thing about being at so many places is that I've been in touch with so many different problems. And every time I go someplace else, you're like, oh, well, here's a different tool set. I can now go back and solve that problem. I either didn't have the worldview or didn't have the tools at that time. So it's, as I look back at a lot of places, and thank goodness my mom forced me to do some internship at hospitals. So I often look at some of the things that are going on in medicine, and one of them is scalpels. They're often coated, but it's how does graphene help with that? And not from a fundamental standpoint, but the look, the feel. Some of them are, I should say, reusable, but they're cleaned and they can be used again. Others are single use only. In both of those, can you actually put material in to help with, I should say, to help the medical community? One other area that I often look at is, we keep saying antibacterial, antimicrobial, things like, I don't know, dental implants, which, they have a lot of issues. They're in a, the mouth is an interesting but very, very adverse environment for materials. So your teeth are like the perfect thing, but by the time you get a filling, I remember a while ago, everyone was like, well, there's a little bit of mercury in fillings. How do we get rid of those? Well, I'm not even sure. We've gone to the UV systems. but there's still the silver, which still has a little bit of mercury or an amalgamate. That's still there. Do you bring a graphene into something like that? So graphene plus the appropriate network, and do you still keep those antibacterial properties, which would prevent further rot? Because most of the things that you have now, silver, doesn't necessarily stop it. It gets to the interface, and neither do the UV systems. So there's a lot. I'm sure the company doesn't let me say much, but there's a lot that happens in my head that I don't necessarily transcribe anywhere. I'm one of those people that wakes up in the middle of the night and like, all right, I got to do that project. So I've gone through a lot of books of projects that I guess I should say I have not even started, but they're potentially really good ideas. I just need to get them off the ground.
That is so exciting. I mean, you were just mentioning some of these application areas where perhaps that's not the first thing when we're thinking about potential for graphene. That's where our mind goes, but those might be some of the areas where it's going to be filling an absolute need. And I never thought about graphene for a dental filling. That is interesting. That is absolutely, and I'm sure that you cannot share a lot with us. So I will make sure Phil doesn't see this with this interview.
Yeah, just keep him off the mailer.
Yes, just don't watch this.
Right.
But those were that's fascinating. Really, it is fascinating for us from two different perspectives. One is, we don't know where truly the potential of graphene is going to be or where it's going to be fitting necessarily. Sure. We can think because, as you mentioned, we come up with, we said, okay, here's a new material. Let's think about it. Can it replace copper? Can it replace this, because it's conventional thinking, right? That's the first step. Sure. What can we do better? With it. But then the second step is, okay, wait, this is a unique material. Actually, we have to think about it as its own self-standing material. What can it really do? Not to replace or make better something else, but on its own, what can it enable? And I think maybe we are getting closer to that perspective. And also the second point that you brought up, which was really cool, was that you've had such a diverse set of experiences that has exposed you to needs. And now that you have a tool, you're going back and you're saying, okay, well, I saw that need over there in a very different industry. And it's something that we are trying to do. We're trying to accomplish with this task force is for all of us to come together and put on the table the needs that might exist in different segments. And maybe your company would have a solution for it. Maybe somebody else's company would have a solution for it. We just have to all come together, right?
Yes, precisely.
Well, it was an absolute pleasure speaking with you. But before I let you go, I warned you I was going to ask you this question. What are you cooking tonight?
Well, I actually just got a grill, so.
Oh, what kind of grill? Now you have to tell us.
I just went on and hit this in. I think it's if I can only remember the brand.
You don't have to tell us the brand. How many different? I don't know.
Turner.
Yes.
No, actually, a traditional charcoal grill.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I love the smell and the taste. We recently got a smoker, and we've been smoking things nonstop.
Oh yeah. Well, that's what I'm doing. I have a selection of meats and vegetables that I'm just going to throw on. I don't know how much of it I'll eat, but if I put enough on, I'll have some choices. That's what I'm going to go with.
Put them in the freezer.
Right. So once it has that smell of charcoal, it'll be fine. It'll last.
What's your favorite thing to put on a grill?
It's actually fish.
Fish?
I usually do like a cedar plank fish, but with a charcoal grill or with a smoker. That way I get the top will have that charcoal type smell and taste, and then the bottom would be cedar. So somewhere in the middle is the blend. So I like fish more so.
What do you do for seasoning for your fish when you put it on the cedar plank?
Lemon, pepper. I like to use my blender and take up a few vegetables, so onions, maybe like a red pepper, and make a sauce in the blender, and then just let the fish sit in there for a few days.
Interesting. Okay.
That's when I go on the cedar. So it's a lot of stuff in there.
I know that sounds like a very lengthy process, but I bet it's going to taste good.
I'm hopeful. It's really like my notepad. I just write some stuff down, and if I ever realize it, I hope I didn't disappoint myself. So.
And at the same time, maybe you're thinking about applications for graphene in, I don't know, cooking or in utensils for cooking, or
of course,
who knows?
Eventually, I'm going to coat the inside of that grill. So
there you go. We got another application coming. Leroy, it was an absolute pleasure having you. Thank you so much for your time. I really do enjoy this conversation.
I certainly appreciate it. Thank you.
Have a great day and a great weekend. Good grilling.
Yes.
Bye.